Hi, everybody. It's good to be back doing another video as we come into summer preparedness. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation. And over the next while, we're going to talk about summer preparedness. And this week, we're talking to Arden, who's the IMT logistics lead. And we're going to have a bit of a talk about what happens and what you can expect from the logistics team. Thanks, Arden.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here as well.
So, Arden, once Red Cross is activated and the logistics team starts up, what's the first thing that volunteers would expect to see and hear from you guys?
So depending on the size of the activation, they'll either get a call from their DevOps officer or the logistics team to see if they are available to be rostered on, or they would be looking out for REDS events to express interest to attend.
Okay. And would they get a text message potentially sometimes?
Yeah, especially kind of after the first couple of weeks when we've exhausted that local capacity, we might send a text message. Sometimes it will go statewide, sometimes it will just go to the neighbouring division, but that's also usually when we have limited resources, and so that will be a call out to see if volunteers are available. But first protocol is usually to get the DevOps officers to ask their teams who's available.
Yeah, no, that's great. So that's how it works. So it could come either of those two ways down to volunteers. So people pop themselves in the REDS events and they're getting themselves ready to go. And then I believe they're going to get a call from the logs team. And what's that about?
Yep, so we'll either have a list from the DevOps officers of who is available or the expressions of interest. So the logistics team will manage that and decide who to roster on. Before we officially roster the volunteers on, we will give them a call to do a pre-deployment questionnaire. So that questionnaire is usually from like 10 to 20, 25 minutes, depending on the content of the call. And that's a really, really important component of getting volunteers ready to go for an activation, because it covers off all the mental preparedness of volunteers to make sure they're aware of the conditions, the psychological and physical and environmental conditions. And it's also like a logistics check as well. So we kind of will be trying to scope out what accommodation needs they might have, where they're coming from, and what all the driving and food needs are. But it's a really important step, and it's something that we have to do for every volunteer. Even if they're activated an incident management team, we still run through that process. So everyone has to go through it every time they're activated.
Thanks, Arden. Yeah, I actually think it's a really valuable process. I've gone through it every time I've been activated, and I don't know a lot of other agencies that do this work. It's just really good for us to stop for a second and to really think about what we're stepping into and making sure that we're ready for it. And it's a demonstration of how Red Cross really values the welfare of all ES people right across the country. Actually, these pre-deployment questionnaires are done, so it's a great thing to do. So, what else can we expect when we're being deployed from the logs team? What other kind of things do you provide?
So essentially when you're deployed, it depends if you'll be a local volunteer. So if you're being deployed in your local area, then the logistics team will just make sure that you have a means to get there. So confirm that you're driving, what you're driving, or transport arrangements are. One thing that the logistics team expects of all volunteers is that if they are driving their own car, that they have comprehensive car insurance. So that's actually something that we check in a pre-deployment questionnaire. And so if they're local, then we will just make sure that they've got their transport arrangements and that it's a safe route that they're taking and that they're aware of where they're going. And then for the volunteers that might need to stay overnight and whatnot, we'll organise their accommodation arrangements as well as any kind of food needs and whatnot as well. But if you're deployed for an activation that requires travel, then we will provide accommodation and breakfast, lunch and dinner as well. But usually it's done as a process where volunteers will either there'll be a agreement with the restaurants where they can charge back to Red Cross as well as the hotels, or volunteers can spend money in the field and then process reimbursements later. That's for meals specifically.
Yeah, so you say that so quickly, but there's so much work in doing that and getting the information out and making sure that everyone's got accommodation, and particularly in the throes of a really busy part of an activation where you could have dozens or maybe a couple of hundred people in the field. So it's a big job.
Yeah, it is.
So after we've been through the activation and we've got all those things in place and we've done our good work in the field, talk to me about end of activation. What are the sort of things, because we don't always talk about this and think about this enough. We get to the end of activations and we can all be a bit exhausted, quite frankly, and all a bit over it. What sort of things do we need to make sure come back to head office?
So there's usually quite a few things that will come back, and it might not always just be at the end of activation, it might be during as well. So the main resources that we will usually be sending to and from the office would be forms that are filled out in the field. So that might be the registration find reunite forms, which has confidential data. So that has to be sent back appropriately to the office so we can store it. Same with things like shift logs. We always need to have those sent back to the office as well. Anything that comes out of the activation kits and register find reunite kits that have been used, they'll be sent back. Usually we'll have those, it depends kind of how busy we are, but we might start working on it before we end the activation. Of course, we might have fleet, so there might have been cars that we've rented or Red Cross fleet that might be in the field. We also need to get those sent back to the head office at the end of the activation as well, or even throughout different activation areas. If we close in one spot and then open up somewhere else a couple hours down, then we need to move that around. And then a lot of the time we do get uniform that kind of goes floating around in the field, and we, when we can, we do need to try to bring all that back as well. There also might be, perhaps depending on the situation, more niche resources that might be in the field, like ones that are requested specifically for that activation, maybe something like a printer that we would have to get sent back, as well as publications. So unless the volunteers might, like the DevOps officers or team leaders might want to keep them at our house for ongoing things, we need to get all that sent back at the end of activation.
Yeah, it's again, there's a bit to consider, particularly those RFR forms are really, really important. And I guess the key would be that if in doubt, ask, because we cover a really broad range of things in our activations, and it's not always exactly what we expect when we go out. But if there's anything that you're unsure about, just reach out and send it back. So we've been through the whole process, and then and then either during activation or we're at the end of it, and we've got expenses. What do we do, Arden?
So expenses, every expense that you use in the field when you're a volunteer, you would reimburse back to Red Cross, and we will process those reimbursements. We actually encourage you to process each reimbursement, like even at the end of your own shift, not necessarily the end of a full activation, but even at the end of the day or end of the 4 days that you're rostered on, because the sooner you get it through, the quicker you'll get your reimbursement. But also it's really important for the state office to get it back, because we have a limited time that we can cost recover. So we have a limited time that we can actually charge back all the money that we spent in the field to the council or EMV. So if we don't get people's reimbursements until 3 months later, after an activation, we actually end up having to pay that out of Red Cross money. Whereas if we get that within the first 30 days after an activation, or even as soon as possible, essentially, we can charge that back, and that's not coming out of Red Cross funds. So it's super important to send back your reimbursements, not just so you can get your money back as soon as possible, but also for the management of a Red Cross budget as well. It's really important.
Oh, thanks, Arden. So I guess the message with expenses reimbursement is a good time to send them back is now.
Yeah, ASAP.
Don't sit on. And the other thing to consider there is as everybody knows, we've got a fairly small staff. So if we get hundreds of receipts and expenses back at the end, it just makes it much harder. So please send them back as soon as you possibly can. And that also enables us to get the money back into your pockets as soon as we can.
Yeah, and it's really easy as well, because it's just an online form which is on Reds. Everyone can access it. You just fill in the information and you can just take a photo of your receipt at the time. Even once you've just spent it, you can just take a photo and send it straight through. So
yeah, and I'll make sure I'll put that link in with the post today. So thank you so much, Arden. Covered a lot of ground there. It's certainly a very busy a part of the IMT. And it's fantastic to have logistics folks there. And as a commander, you just know that stuff's looked after and stuff happens. And it's really quite amazing, the amount of work and the volume of stuff that the team get through. So thanks for your time today.
That's all good. Thanks so much, Anthony, for giving me the opportunity to talk about all things logistics.